Hello and welcome to Mysteries of Science. My name's Dan and I'm the editor of Science and Nature, the monthly magazine from the team behind The Week Junior.
And I'm Michael, the junior editor. We're coming to you from under the sea on a very special expedition.
Yes, we're on the search for Atlantis, the ancient civilization that was lost to the sea.
Now, lots of you asked us to investigate this, so we thought we'd go diving with some experts to find out whether or not Atlantis really exists, and if it does, where it might be.
Oh, Michael, what's that over there?
I don't know, Dan. Let's go have a look. This is Mysteries of Science.
Hi, my name is Kira, and I want to know all about Atlantis. Is it real? Where is it? And why can't we find any artifacts from it? Thanks.
Hi, I'm Libby, and I have a question about Atlantis. Was it ever real, and did people ever live there?
Atlantis. Just saying the name fills you with this sense, or fills me at least with a sense of adventure. Have you always wondered where it might be, Michael?
Do you know what I have, actually? When I was growing up, I remember watching again and again and again the Disney film Atlantis, The Lost Empire. It's one of the lesser-known Disney films, but to this day remains one of my favourites.
I've not seen that one, actually. The Little Mermaid's more my style. I'll have to check it out. But of course, there's been so many stories about Atlantis. I'm actually reading a magical book with my 5-year-old at the moment, featuring mermaids and magic gems and lots of underwater rainbows. But what I'd like to know is how old these stories are and where they came from and what questions we'll be addressing in this episode, Michael.
Well, Dan, we are going to find out exactly where these stories came from, when people first started talking about Atlantis, what real places might have inspired it, and whether or not these stories are kind of scientifically plausible.
Oh, sounds brilliant. Right, I think it's time to meet our first guest.
Hello, my name's Cinzia. I'm a YouTuber and a PhD student in classics, which means I specialise in reading about ancient history, mythology, and just classical literature in general. Over on my YouTube channel, I love to cover history topics and amplify things that I think are overlooked, or debunk mysteries and the mysteries of the ancient world, and give a real tweak on what people may have picked up, superstitions, etc.
Cinzia has been making a series of videos on her YouTube channel all about Atlantis, so she seems like the perfect person to tell us where this story came from.
Okay, so the story of Atlantis goes all the way back to a story by Plato that was documented in one of what's known as the Socratic dialogues. And in this particular Socratic dialogue that is called Critias, this is written about 360 BCE. According to the dialogue, in it, there's Socrates, who's a famous philosopher that you may have heard of, and he's telling the story of it to several other people. He's discussing with 3 men, myths that you have heard around the world. And one of them, this guy called Critias, tells the story of how his grandfather met a man called Solon, who was one of the 7 ancient sages who had been to Egypt and heard all about Atlantis, this magical magical realm that existed all this time ago.
Crikey, Critias! Wow. The first time that Atlantis was mentioned was back in a story told in 360 BCE. That's a load further back than I thought was possible. Well, not that I thought was possible, but then certainly I realised. Now, showing my ignorance here, who was this Plato geezer then?
So, this Plato chap, he was a Greek philosopher. Now, he might sound ancient to us, obviously telling stories all the way back in 360 BCE, but Atlantis is even older. It's so old, it's even old to Plato, because the story is meant to have taken place 9,000 years before Plato's time.
9,000 years before Plato, wow. So we're not just going deep beneath the ocean this episode, we're also going way back deep into time.
Now, I wonder actually how that very first story of Atlantis compares to all the other stories about it we've seen since. Cinzia, can you tell us how Atlantis was described in Plato's story?
According to the story, this empire of Atlantis ruled over several islands and part of Africa and Europe. And Atlantis is arranged in a fantastical way. It's arranged in concentric circles of alternating land and water. And, the soil is rich and fertile. This architecture is magnificent. It's the ultimate civilization, filled with tombs and fantastic temples.
Sounds idyllic, like the perfect place to go on holiday, apart from it being underwater. I mean, how did it end up underwater then?
Atlantis became, quite arrogant. The word is called hubris. It means pride. They became quite prideful, and they tried to attack Egypt, and they also tried to attack Athens. But the Athenians rised up against them. This very small, little tiny, Greek city rose against the great Atlanteans. And after that, apparently, there were violent earthquakes and floods. And in a single day and night, according to Plato, rain fell upon the island and it sunk beneath the ocean. And in all manner of fact, Atlantis vanished off the face of the earth and has never been seen again. So that's what people believe in. People who take the story literally, they believe that this island sank within a day.
So Atlantis was this perfect island, the centre of a vast civilization, got a bit too big for its boots, started invading other countries.
Exactly. And after the Greek city of Athens rose up against them, Atlantis was sort of almost punished for its actions by this massive flood which saw it sink beneath the ocean.
I did notice that Cinzia said something about there being people who take the story literally, so that sent my antenna waggling. Does that mean this story isn't true?
Well, according to Cinzia, people didn't actually start taking Atlantis seriously as a place that might really exist until the 19th century.
This American congressman in 1882 called Ignatius Donnelly published this scientific book, a pseudo-scientific book, I should say, called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. He basically argued Atlantis was the real-life Garden of Eden. Everything originated from here: religion, structures, everything, our folklore. And he argued that the Atlanteans were not just in the Mediterranean, they went all the way up to Mexico, the Mississippi River, the Amazon, the Pacific coast of America, Europe and Africa, the Baltic Black Sea. And it was all a fantastical story, and it became a really popular book. And that is literally where we get all our ideas of Atlantis. This one man, Ignatius Donnelly, sparked off an interest. It was a big bestseller. And it's only ever since then that people believed it was real.
So what did the people in Plato's time think Atlantis was about, if it wasn't a real place? I mean, I'm thinking that Plato must have got his ideas from somewhere, right?
So most ancient scholars would argue that what Atlantis is actually symbolizing is actually the fall of the Minoan civilization. The Minoans were seen as not the anti-Athenian, but they were seen as something that the Athens should be wary of copying, because they believed what happened to the Minoan civilization was a cause of their own pride and hubris. And that happened, it's called the Thera eruption.
Ah, okay, so Thera, that's a volcano?
Yeah, so it's the name of a volcano and also the name of an island. Today that island goes by another name, one some of you might have heard of, Santorini. Now, this volcanic eruption devastated the island. In fact, it's thought to be one of the largest volcanic eruptions in human history.
So the Minoan civilization was massively affected by a huge eruption of Thera several hundred years before Plato wrote about the account of Atlantis. And it didn't wipe them out in the same way Atlantis is wiped out. It didn't blow up a country or anything very visual like that, but it did affect the Minoans economically. And that economic downfall of being stranded, not having, the land as fertile as it used to be, and their waters being polluted by ash, etc., caused them to deteriorate as a civilization. And because people didn't really understand how, the world worked, volcanic eruptions were seen as things from like gods, and earthquakes were seen as these supernatural things and concepts, they saw that as almost a punishment of the Minoan civilization. And Plato, therefore, talking to this about this Atlantis, he kind of metamorphosed and created a metaphor.
Wow, that's fascinating. And so when was all of this supposed to have happened?
So this was in 1600 BCE.
Wow, okay, we've got quite a lot of dates now, I think. Let's try and organise it. How about we put together a timeline?
1600 BCE, the Thera eruption devastates the Minoan civilization.
360 BCE, Greek philosopher Plato tells a story about a city called Atlantis, which, like Thera to the Minoans, was devastated by a natural disaster.
1882, Ignatius Donnelly writes a book about Atlantis, claiming that it's real and bringing the mystery back into the spotlight. And I think that brings us up to date.
Actually, Michael, there's one date you've missed there. 2022, the Mysteries of Science podcast solves the Atlantis mystery once and for all.
Of course. I mean, all of our episodes are going in the history books.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully for the right reasons. So it sounds to me like Atlantis is actually a fable, a story that's supposed to teach people lessons, that it didn't actually exist, unless, of course, Plato knew something that we don't.
Well, Plato probably knew a lot of things that we don't, but just because we can't prove whether or not his Atlantis existed, that doesn't mean that there might not be a Atlantis out there.
Huh? What do you mean?
Well, Dan, what if I told you there was such a thing as the Welsh Atlantis, and there's been new evidence to suggest that it was actually real?
Oh, yes! Why, Samuel? It's the Welsh Atlantis. Tell me more.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi, I'm David Willis. I'm the professor of Celtic at the University of Oxford. My main job is to look at language change and how that happens, but I got involved in this project with a colleague in Wales who's a geologist, and so we've been looking together at the Welsh sunken cities stories, and trying to link the geology and the literature and the folklore together.
Hi, David. Well, we've heard about the Greek Atlantis, Plato's Atlantis, but I'm dying to hear more about the Welsh Atlantis.
So, it's reasonably well known that there are a lot of hints, brief mentions in medieval Welsh literature of a land, of various kings and rulers and people who used to have lands that were subsequently overrun by the sea. And so all of these little hints in various places sort of make you think that there must be something interesting behind it.
Right, okay, I'm getting Google Maps out. Where are we talking about?
There are these ridges off the west coast of Wales. So under the sea. So if you look at the depth of the sea off the west coast of Wales, there are patches where the sea is very shallow, those are in little lines coming off the west coast. And the most northerly one is called San Patrick, so Patrick's Causeway it's called, and that's very close to the surface. I think sometimes it even is even visible above the surface. It was clear that these causeways are kind of interesting from the perspective of these stories, because ridges that were only a little way under the sea today, they might have been above the sea in times gone by. So that's really where the interest of trying to connect the two comes from.
Oh, this sounds promising for offshore islands, like roadways going out to them. And where's this bombshell piece of evidence that we need to find?
So there's this thing called the Goth map. So this is a medieval map. It's really the first sort of complete map of Britain. And although, like all medieval maps, it's a bit schematic, it's got a lot of things marked on it that are pretty accurate in principle. I mean, the rivers are all there in sort of vaguely the right place, and the cities are all there in kind of vaguely the right place. And it's got a lot of islands on it. And for Wales, it's got about 10 islands marked off the coast of Wales, and they're all pretty accurate, except that there are these two islands sort of off the middle of the west coast. They look like they're off the coast right in the middle, right off Aberystwyth, and there aren't any islands there today. So it's a bit, to raise this question: why did they put these islands there? Is it a mistake? But on the whole, the map's not. I mean, the map's not bad overall. There aren't other things there which are just wrong, or are they in the wrong place, or what's the issue there? So that maybe raised the question that they were really these ridges that in the early medieval period might have been above the waterline and might have been visible, and that they might have used those as the reason for putting something on the map there.
So if we reckon that these islands existed, definitely did, when would they have been around?
If they survived long enough to be on these maps, they'd have to have been around in sort of the early Middle Ages. They'd have to have still been around in the sort of 11th, 12th centuries. Even if the map's based on memory rather than actually being there. I mean, the map itself is probably from the 14th century, so that might suggest they were sort of still around then, or had recently been around.
And so how did they end up underwater then? Was there a kind of massive natural disaster like the Atlantis story?
Normal coastal erosion processes, and we find this, all around the coast of Britain. And it's clear, for instance, that the coastline in the west of Wales has just eroded from the sea, and that the coastline was, in some places several kilometres further west than it is today. I think that's clear in Aberystwyth, for instance, that the coastline was not where it is today. It was a little bit further west, and so these islands would have been fairly soft and quite vulnerable to coastal erosion.
Okay, so no massive volcanic eruptions off the west coast of Wales, which I guess is no great surprise, as there's no volcanoes there. But yeah, I remember the story of Cantregaelod, and it was a story of hubris. I think that they had they were doing really well, and they had a party, and somebody got too drunk and just forgot to lock the gates, and they let the sea in, and it was, the sea came in and it disappeared beneath the waves, the entire land.
Okay, so it is a little bit similar to the Atlantis story then, another kind of tale of human folly, human hubris. But I guess it also shows us that idea of an island sinking beneath the sea is scientifically plausible, and sadly it's actually becoming more of a reality due to climate change.
The Atlantis story is very relevant to what's happening today. We are losing islands all the time at the moment, and our current climate crisis is actually demonstrating that. And it's happening as we speak. In the past couple of years, since 2011, we've already lost 5 Pacific islands, and 3 of those were lost since 2019, within 2019. And at least 20 other islands across the world are expected to, quote, disappear over the next few decades. And it's predicted that by 2100, the sea will have risen enough so much to have sunk the majority of cities on the east coast of the United States of America. Losing land to the ocean is a very real thing, and it's not something to be admirable about. It's something that's a very prevalent concept in our current climate crisis, and Plato had no idea that his Atlantis myth would have that effect thousands of years later.
That's it's a very interesting point. So even though it was told all the way back in 360 BCE, Plato's Atlantis story is actually more relevant than ever today.
Yeah, I mean, we were asking right at the beginning of the show whether Atlantis exists, and if it does, then where it might be. Well, perhaps the answer is that Atlantis does exist, and it could be anywhere where a piece of land has been lost to the ocean due to the actions of humanity.
Yeah, well, don't fear, because there's quite a lot we can do about it. We're going to devote an entire episode to climate change and what we can all do to fix it. We'll hear from experts about what climate change is, what's causing it, and also what we can do to help.
Right, I think I'm ready to come back up to the surface now, Dan, and get on some dry land.
Yeah, me too. Let's come up for air.
Now, as we mentioned right at the beginning of the episode, this was a mystery that was requested by you, our listeners, and we'd love to hear from you again.
Yes, what mysteries would you love us to investigate? The final episode of this season will be dedicated to your mysteries, where we put your questions to the experts.
If you'd like to send us a question, just head to funkidslive.com/mysteries. There you can leave us a voice message by tapping the big red button. We can't wait to hear from you.
But don't worry, it's not the final episode of the season yet. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time with our next mystery. And it's a spooky one.
Yes, for Halloween we're going ghost busting. Join us if you dare. But until then, stay curious.
Stay curious.
Thanks for listening to The Week Junior Show, which is made by the same people that make The Week Junior magazine. You can get a free trial of The Week Junior by heading to theweekjunior.co.uk/podcast and using the code podcast at checkout.